So should Canada view this sentencing as a provocation? And what should Canada do to prevent relations from China from deteriorating even further? Yves Tiberghien is a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia and a distinguished fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. He joins me now via Skype from Main Island, British Columbia. Thank you very much for joining me today, Professor. The first question I want to ask you is former Canadian Ambassador Guy Saint-Jacques told our network earlier today that he thinks the retrial of Canadian Robert Schellenberg was fabricated and that the death sentence was predetermined. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, it's hard to know the exact outcome, right? Also, this is an intermediary stage. There will be two more appeals, first at the High People Court and next at the Supreme People's Court. So we are only in one stage in the process. On one hand, what is clear is that there is very, very strong law enforcement against drug smuggling in China, and there's a stronger public demand for it. There have been a series of foreigners executed in the last years, and it's not just in China, also Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, etc. But on this case, in this particular instance, there was quite a bit of political showcasing around it. Journalists were brought in. There was a very, very speedy trial, and there was some press coverage around it. Fiery statements from Global Times, etc. That sort of hint of a politicization of it, or of a particularly harsh message going through that stage. Doesn't mean this will be carried through the other stages, but that's where I think Guy Saint-Jacques is observing that there's something pretty unpleasant about this stage. So
you don't necessarily agree that this outcome was predetermined, at least at this point, because there are further options ahead?
Right. I mean, it's not the end of the process, but there seems to be testimonies or statements that were made last week from people in the public media or politics that were hinting at future harsh treatments of Canadians. So if that's the case, that shows that there was some pre-planning of the trial. But this is one stage. I'm hopeful that if that was the case, if they didn't follow as much due process as there is in China, then there will be a better outcome at the later stages.
Given the timing here, do you think that this increased sentence, do you think that has anything to do with retaliation for Canada's arrest of Meng Wanzhou, the CFO of Huawei?
So we will never be able to prove it, but what is sure is that there's a mood of anger in China, and they're always trying to find levers to express that displeasure or that anger, which is also public level anger, not just official. And so in that sense, there is potential suspicion that there was linkage, yes.
So you sort of alluded to it earlier, but what are the next steps for Mr. Schellenberg? You said there are some appeals process he can go through. What further steps does he take next to try and get this sentence knocked down?
So the next stage, he has 10 days to appeal to the High People Court. And then after that, there's a mandatory appeal, a mandatory review by the Supreme People's Court, which reviews all the death penalty cases. And they actually overturned 15% of death penalty cases. They can also give a death penalty with 2-year probation, which means life sentence, actually. So those are the steps. It will take months, maybe a year, but it will overshadow relationships, there is no question.
Back in 2016, when Justin Trudeau first went to China, he and Chinese officials set up what's called, I believe it's the Canada-China high-level dialogue on national security and rule of law. Do you think that a meeting between those high-level Canadian officials and high-level Chinese officials, do you think that a meeting of that nature would help take the temperature down here?
Yes, I agree. I think it's a good idea. And that committee built on earlier work that was done between Canada and China over rule of law. The advantage is that it's a technical meeting which allows for very good quality of discussions, maybe a discussion about the due process, respecting full due process, the right of defendants, etc. So I think that's a very good idea.
But in that conversation about due process, doesn't China just typically do what China wants to do, whether it doesn't matter who's complaining about what? Doesn't China just do that?
To a large extent, yes, but they can be at least a frank discussion and exchange of information, better understanding. I think those low-level, the public statements sometimes don't have at the low level technical working meetings can have a positive role.
My next question has to do with the case of Michael Kovrig. He is the former Canadian diplomat who was arrested, and we learned about his case before we learned of Michael Spavor. On Friday, the Prime Minister kind of dropped something that none of us were expecting, saying that accused China of violating the principles of diplomatic immunity, even though when we had asked the government previously whether Mr. Kovrig was traveling on his diplomatic passport, the answer had been no. A spokesperson for China's foreign ministry said today that Mr. Kovrig is not entitled to diplomatic immunity. What do you make of China's decision there, or their assessment there? Also, the Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson said that Canada is making itself a laughingstock with specious statements. What do you make of that?
Well, so the flurry language, of course, is part of that angry back and forth. But in terms of merit of the situation, of course, this is more for an international lawyer, right, to assess. But as I was reading the Vienna Convention, and the Vienna Convention does, in terms of letter of the law, does give immunity only to people accredited to a mission. Or there's Article 39 that says people after the end of their work in the mission could have an extended period of immunity, but only insofar as they do work related to the mission. So by the letter of the law, it's probable that China is correct, that immunity ends once the person has ended the work at the embassy, especially when he was traveling with a personal passport. But there could be a bit of gray zone in the sense that he's still a former diplomat, he's a diplomat on leave. And so, there could be room for extending if the country agreed. So maybe that's where the Prime Minister was coming from.
So does that, from your perspective, look like a last shot in the dark, trying something to try and move that case along?
Yeah, I think the Prime Minister is doing everything he can to protect our comrade, Michael Kovrig, and also to find anything that could help the case. I suppose it's a way to show care and attention.
The Canada-China relationship is certainly at a very low point right now. What can Canada do? What is the best advice you have for the Canadian government on how to ease these tensions?
Well, the key is to not get caught up in a spiral of anger and emotions. We have to be very cool and strategic about it. It's more, international politics is a game of chess. And so we have to probably de-escalate. And in the short term, I think having a low-key mission, but with someone, an envoy maybe, that could be to have really low-key discussions on diffusing this whole bubble of anger. Any statement on one side that's quite emotional leads to another one on the other side, and then the public gets inflamed. That's not helpful. So I'm hoping that we can find a way to take it in a more strategic way. Then after that, a lot will depend on what the court does in Canada. So in terms of the MENG cases in the court, the case remains complicated because it's rare to have a case of request of extradition based on unilateral sanctions by a country, in the case on Iran here, where the sanction law is different, etc. So the case is uncertain, but the key is to follow the due process while finding ways that the emotions and all the language.
All right, Professor Tiberghien, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.